Hello and welcome. This is News Club UK, a weekly panel show that goes where others don't or won't. I am your host, Thomas Barlow, and this week we are joined by a great panel. Let me introduce them. We've got Hazel Healy from the New Internationalist. Hazel Healy is a co-editor at the New Internationalist, a 48-year-old magazine with a global perspective and a focus on social and environmental stories. Recent magazines by Hazel covered migration, climate breakdown, and peace. And for the next year, she's coordinating the Food Justice Files, dedicated to exploring the new and not so new hunger and ways to reform our food systems. Next, this week, we've got Kerry-Ann Mendoza. I'm excited to announce that Kerry-Ann Mendoza, co-founder and editor-at-large of the Canary, author of Austerity, Demolition of the Welfare State and Rise of the Zombie Economy, and perennial thorn in the side of the establishment, will be joining us this week to dish out some absolute sauce, I hope. We will be joined later on, hopefully, by Penny Wangari-Jones. Penny Wangari-Jones is an anti-racist activist, organizer and director at the Racial Justice Network, with a focus on coloniality, social justice, race equality and equity, and marginalized communities. Her interests include migration, intersections, building power, and movements. She's also undertaking a PhD at the University of Manchester on the impact of coloniality on Black activism. And finally, and we can bring him on screen so you're going to get to see him now, Adam Ramsay from Open Democracy. Adam he's really given me a chore here because I let them write their own intros, and Adam's given me this. Adam is average height, perhaps a tad heavier than he should be, but just a tad, has shaggy brown hair, blue eyes, and a fondness for cooking over-rich food, a sensitivity to depression, and a recent ADHD diagnosis. He was once described by Boris Johnson as surprisingly bourgeois and has been an editor at Open Democracy since 2013, where he's done a bunch of different stuff, apparently. This is this week's panel. Hello, guys. How you doing?
You're asking for a description, Tom. You didn't say, you bio. You said, can you give a description of yourself? So I did my best.
It's beautiful, and it veers from the factual reality in some regards, I think, but it's a beautiful one nonetheless.
Every single one of that is true.
Okay, fair enough. You know Boris Johnson better than me, then. For him to call anyone surprising and bourgeois is beyond the pale. But anyways, we digress. We've got articles, we've got pieces of news to talk about from each of our panelists that they've selected and that we think are particularly interesting. And this is what we mean when we talk about covering the news that others won't or don't. We want to cover independent news, campaigners news, the stories that the establishment media aren't going to be talking about, or if they are, maybe not with the slant or insights that we get from our guests here. So I'm really excited to get into those. And we're going to start straight away with Kerry-Ann Mendoza's piece. So Kerry-Ann Mendoza's piece that she selected is from the Canary, which is an excellent publication. And there's links in the description for all of these. So please do check them out, and I'll be shouting them out more during the show, even if I'm an antagonistic host. So the piece is another Boris Johnson disaster just advanced Scottish independence. Despite the risk of coronavirus cancellation, devolved elections in Scotland are scheduled for the 6th of May 2021. The newly formed Action for Independence has labelled it the independence election, and opinion polls appear to show support for Scottish independence is growing. On the 15th of November, born out of frustration with Johnson's handling of Brexit and coronavirus, Scottish National Party Westminster leader Ian Blackford announced a second independence referendum will take place next year. So talk of Scottish independence was already high on the agenda. But then Boris Johnson entered the fray to inadvertently give the pro-independence movement a little bit of extra support, because on a Zoom call to Northern English Conservative MPs, he reportedly said Scottish devolution had been a disaster and a mistake. Spokesperson for AFI, Derek McPherson, told the Canary, with this comment, Johnson has once again shown his complete and utter contempt for democracy and for the Scottish people, who voted overwhelmingly for devolution in 1997. His every utterance only helps ensure that we will deliver a similarly strong verdict when we next vote on independence. So let's bring in Kerry-Ann to talk about this. And I've got a few, as I say, awkward, annoying questions for you. And this is, let's kick off with this. This is a great headline, but has this really caused any trouble in Scotland? Because people have been talking about the breakup of the union for well over a decade. There's been threats and counter threats of referenda. Why do you think this revelation makes any difference?
Well, I think firstly I'd categorise this. This is a trending story. So the purpose of a trending story at the Canary is to kind of capture a theme and a moment and communicate it to a mass audience. It's not an investigation. It's not an analysis piece. So that's the reason for the sort of the tone. And it's really, I think, symbolic of the issues of the disintegration of the United Kingdom, really, that we're seeing at the moment. And the reason I chose the story today was because although it's a Scottish story, there's also a hell of a lot going on in Wales at the moment around. There are parallel experiences in the sense that, you know, one of the struggles that the English working class has at the moment is it's sort of bought into the narrative that there is no alternative, either to capitalism or to the Westminster system of politics. But the devolved parliaments are actually kind of, and the fact that they're both significantly to the left of Westminster, are actually showing working class populations in both nations that actually, one, there is an alternative, and two, it's significantly preferable to the sort of the neoliberal system that's operating in Westminster. So yeah, it's very exciting times. And I should say I've moved last year from living in Bristol in the west of England over into the valleys of Wales. And that really has been an enormously eye-opening experience for me, not just as a journalist, but just as a human being, to realise the sort of the massively different culture here among working class people. There's a pride about being working class and a respect for solidarity and community that I've seen eroded in England actually during my lifetime. So it's really refreshing to see. And what's extra exciting is the fact that it's now gaining incredible power, you know, politically, both in Scotland and in Wales. You know, because the way I look at it, I think the left in England often see the idea of an independent Scotland and an independent Wales as sort of the end of socialism in England. That's it, guys. You know, you're running off, you're abandoning us. How are we going to defeat the Tories without you? But I think what they're failing to think about is the lesson of there is an alternative. Because if you have a thriving socialist Scotland, north of England, and a thriving socialist Wales, west of England, there you have, right on your borders, two fully functioning, successful socialist nations. It could be a very, very powerful thing for the English left too.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, because what I'd like to ask then is, do you think this is something the establishment media are missing? Do you think they should be reporting on it more? We saw last week the foundation of the Northern Independence Party, and certainly there's been from the devolved authority of Greater Manchester a response that, again, you know, when this devolved authority didn't exist, Manchester's voice, Greater Manchester's voice, has been completely insignificant politically for at least the past decade, if not maybe the past 40 years, in terms of the respect it's given by Westminster. And suddenly these devolved powers are starting to say, well, we can showcase something different. Do you think the media should be talking about this more?
I don't think we should expect them to, because we sort of then would be kind of pretending the established media is anything other than what it is, which is in service of the establishment on the whole. So I don't, you know, it's an English-centric media. It's only really kind of acknowledged that Scotland existed, you know, since the independence movement gained traction. Before then, you'd rarely get a story from Scotland. It's still pretending Wales doesn't exist. I mean, you very rarely get a kind of Welsh perspective or any idea what's going on in Wales, actually. I think, you know, when I was living in Bristol, you know, I can see Wales. It's over there, you know, and in terms of actually finding out about anything that was happening in the country by utilising mainstream resources, it was just not a goer. So no, I don't expect them to cover it effectively. And I think the closer we get to the actual votes, you know, we've essentially got two independence elections next year, one in Scotland, one in Wales. And those are going to be very, very exciting elections. We've had a big day for Welsh democracy today, because today we've actually had a bill passed which enables in the local elections as well as Senate elections, everyone aged 16 and over can now vote, including foreign-born residents, and also proportional representation in local government, which is single transferable votes. It's a massive, massive day. And again, it's, you're seeing the suffrage franchise being expanded, in Scotland and in Wales, and what's happening in England. And I think the more independent media serves this purpose of reporting into that kind of English bubble to say, look, not everything is about Westminster and the Labour Party. There is a lot of other stuff that's going on literally miles away from you, not the other side of the earth, just miles away from you, that you can take lessons from and build upon. And I think that's the biggest gift really that the devolved nations can give the English left at this point, is to say, look at these movements, look how they have moved from grassroots movements to gaining organisation and a political expression, and they're now both kind of moving towards the brink of realising those political aims. It's absolutely fascinating stuff.
Well, and we're lucky to have with us today Adam Ramsay, who's not only Scottish but involved in the Scottish Greens, who are pro-independence, and will be able to give us some extra insights, because one of the things, Adam, that I've noticed when I've been in Scotland is how radically different the media ecology is. And it's always surprising to me once I come back to England how little we hear, even if we're pretty switched on, how little we hear of Scotland. And so I wanted to open up two questions here. The first one is about the Action for Independence. I don't know very much about this. So what does it stand for, and how is it different to the Yes campaign? And does it really have any chance of achieving its goals? First, I'll ask Adam, and then I'll come to you, Kerry-Ann, if that's okay.
Action for Independence is one of a number of parties which has kind of started in the last few months, which is trying to kind of benefit from the election system in Scotland by hiving a few votes off the SNP. To be honest, I'm quite skeptical about their attempt. Basically, what they're saying is because they get 2 votes in the Scottish Parliament elections, you get a constituency vote and a regional list vote, and the total number of MSPs you get from your list is kind of your vote divided by the number of seats you've already got on the constituency. And this, in a sense, an attempt to game that system. Now, I think that's very unlikely to work. I think that people will vote for, what the party they've heard of and what they believe in. And if you do want to vote for a party on the list that's different, because basically the point that they're making is the SNP is going to win most constituencies. You'll get more seats for pro-independent MSPs if you vote for another pro-independence party on the list. Now, the first thing is the obvious one of those is the Greens. And, a party needs to get about 6% in order to make it into Parliament at all. So the chances are that all of these parties won't really, make it onto the list. And also, to be honest, a bunch of these parties have kind of split from the SNP for often quite regressive reasons. I don't, to be honest, remember which one's which. You have to, it's about a bit like following sort of the various tiny Trotskyite groups to remind yourself which is which. So I can't remember who they are exactly, but a number of them have, split from the SNP, not for the lots of good progressive reasons you might, but to be honest, for often slightly less good reasons. I don't want to imply that they're hard right or anything. I doubt they're like that, but they won't be getting my vote in May.
Yeah. Well, on that note, then, Kerry-Ann, what do you see? What do you know about that? And also, what I'd like to ask you is about the SNP, because some of the reports you hear in the establishment media here makes out the SNP as being less popular, actually, and that they try and source tweets of people reacting negatively to Nicola Sturgeon and so forth. So if you can tell us a bit about the AFI, but also what your understanding is of the SNP and how the support for independence is going in Scotland.
Yeah, I think the reality is that the SNP are still the best hope in terms of winning the most seats in an election and then turning that into independence. That I don't think anyone serious is kind of contesting that. And I think a lot of these groups that sprung up were mostly in response to the 2016 elections, when the SNP struggled to win the list MSPs. So there's now, you know, as Adam has referred to, there's now a sort of, okay, if we can actually generate, you know, more independence options, if people don't want to go for the SNP, they've got another option, and then that would secure independence, and then people can do whatever the hell they want to politically after that point. With the idea being that we just focus on independence next year, and then we talk about, you know, the ultimate kind of what Scotland are we now going to create once we're independent following that. And I, to be honest, I think that's a pretty good way to go, a pretty solid way to go. I don't think we need to have these arguments right now. I think it's you know, kind of a mistake because you then start dividing the movement in kind of unnecessary ways. So I think I'd be broadly comfortable with the approach people are taking, to be honest. You know, it's succeeded so far. And in terms of, you know, the way that Nicola Sturgeon has reported, I mean, I was talking with our citizen Tommy, excuse me, last night, and he was saying, you know, the SNP is not a socialist party. You know, there are a lot of socialists in Scotland that will look at certain things that the SNP do and say, well, that's not us. But they are left enough that you know, things like, you know, nuclear disarmament and, you know, the free prescriptions and the anti-tuition fee stuff that just you wouldn't get from a party kind of the start of the SNP down south. So yeah, I think most of it's kind of noise. I think what Westminster really needs right now is Nicola Sturgeon to be unpopular and to be divisive and controversial and all of these normal buzzwords that we get from those kind of glorified gossip columns of Westminster, in order to sort of try and make it become a self-fulfilling prophecy, really, that you make enough noise. And, you know, kind of what they did with Corbyn, really. It was, you know, that similar thing of like throw enough mud and you hope eventually some of it will stick. But as you say, the journalism ecosphere and ecosystem in Scotland is much more vibrant. I think there's a lot more independent media happening. Independence has a big voice in terms of the media. They're not the establishment media, but strong independent voices. And everyone there went through the experience of Project Fear, which I think really has galvanized people to think a lot more critically about what they're being told, who they're being told it by, and the reason, which I think a lot of people still are not getting south of the border.
Yeah. Well, just to come back to a point that you made there, and I want to bring Hazel and Penny in on this. And this is sort of the final question. In future, by the way, guys, if the audience drops in some questions in the comments this week, we definitely will get to them, and we'll try to get to at least one per section. But I wanted to speak to Hazel and Penny. And hello, Penny, lovely to see you. About the fact that the SNP are seen as, not necessarily socialist, right? Certainly, you know, they're more progressive maybe than Westminster. And what I wanted to ask is, as internationalists, what do you think of Scottish nationalism when you're looking at it from outside? Does it concern you that there's a rise in nationalist populism? Or do you broadly support a sort of separatism that weakens the power of Westminster? Because, you know, there are seemingly pluses and minuses, and nationalism is something maybe to be wary of. I'll come to Hazel first, if that's okay.
Hi, yeah, I think that it depends on the values that the nationalists hold. So you have to remember that in the liberation of African states, those were nationalist projects. There are times when you need to reassert your sovereignty and define yourself as a nation. I think the real test for me is how you relate to people of other nationalities within and around you. So what would be a Scottish, if Scotland was its own country, how would it treat people who weren't from Scotland? How would it treat refugees and asylum seekers or other new arrivals? And what would its outlook be, towards the rest of the world? So yes, it can go either way. And I would come back to what Kerry-Ann said about needing to see alternatives, and that sometimes these smaller geographies are somehow freed up in a sense to actually think differently and come up with alternative visions for how to organize society in a way that I think is helpful. Yeah.
Penny, how do you find that argument? What do you think about Scottish nationalism from the outside, or even nationalist populism?
I think I'd go with what Hazel just said, that there is a danger or kind of tricky to find a balance, because we have to obviously acknowledge the historical harms that English or the historic part of what's happened before, to kind of create that sense of like not just an identity but strength and patriotism as well. So because without that, then it means there's a bit of a misjuncture, and it feels like you're asking for compassion for people who've also been harmed or historically. But yes, but when it tips over on the other side, how does it embrace people who don't necessarily identify as Scottish, but who haven't necessarily perhaps participated in some of that historical stuff? How do we find that balance?
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's actually, to be fair, we've sort of reached the point at the end of that section. It kind of asks more questions than it answers in some. We have to pay a lot more attention, I think, as time goes on, to what's happening in Scotland, especially as I say, in England, that makes it work, but it certainly is a more democratic system than first past the post. And so to see this as a potential possibility in Wales in council elections, I believe, and to see the movements in Scotland, we should pay attention. We'll certainly be trying here to make sure that we continue to have Scottish voices and we bring in more Welsh voices as we go forward. But let's move forward onto the next topic, and we're going to be bringing in Penny. I'm really glad that she's joined us. I've got a long introduction to do here, but it's really worth it. We're doing a piece that's called Track and Trace: Police and the Criminalisation of the Marginalised, which Penny's Racial Justice Network has produced, and it's a brilliant piece. A link is in the description. And again, I'm going to try and ask some Aggie questions so they can be slapped down. But first, we're going to do the intro and let you see for yourself what you think about this. So the article reads as thus: police will now be able to access track and trace information on people instructed to self-isolate. Those who fail to self-isolate face fines between £1,000 to £10,000. This latest government action will have disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities and those from lower income backgrounds, in particular migrants, who have already been bearing the brunt of COVID-19. Police access to track and trace information is just another way the carceral state has infiltrated the healthcare and immigration systems in this country. Instead of addressing the systemic inequalities fueled by white supremacy, Black and brown people, migrants, and those from lower income backgrounds are seen as disposable. What of those who simply cannot self-isolate? Why are we criminalizing those who feel the necessity of having to go out and work because of the very real fear of becoming destitute? This is worse for migrants who have no recourse to public funds, which means they cannot access any government help, including universal credit. Nearly 1.4 million cannot access public funds due to their immigration status, yet the demand to access government help has doubled since March. The police use of Motorola's Pronto software, police reporting and notebook organizer, which all includes biometric fingerprint app, which connects police and immigration databases, has been updated with COVID-19 penalty functions. This is the result of emergency police powers granted by the new coronavirus bill on March the 26th, 2020. This new development compounds the unequal impact of the pandemic with the discrimination and lack of account embedded in police technologies given under the coronavirus bill, and found that Asian people received at least 13% of penalty fines, even though they only represent 7.8% of the population. So that's 13% fines, but only 7.8% of the population. And Black people were issued 5% of the fines, despite only being 3.5% of England's populations. How are we to trust the police who are institutionally racist with our data? So if we bring Penny back in, I've got a few questions for you here on this quite big piece. And, you know, certain people, they find hearing this information discomforting. So let's start off with some of the awkward questions here. And let's say, you know, surely the track and trace system is needed, and the police need to be involved to help enact the tracing and enact, the fines to ensure that people self-isolate when due. What is the answer to this? Should we be moving to more local institutions and avoiding big central institutions like government and big corporations? Or shouldn't we just accept that really the police are the best people for the job and kind of ignore this data?
I think, the historically, again, I feel like I've used the word historical quite a few times, and I will do again, because having seen what the police have done with data, not just stop and search, stop and scan, as probably later on talk about it, I don't think they're the best people to handle this stuff. But it's also this push that we have from not just the government, but institutions nationally, to grant powers to an institution that's already quite powerful to become not judge and jury, but also capable of enacting more harm to communities. So this particular, obviously the piece that we've just spoken about, we've seen people who've been stopped. I think it was 54% at one point in terms of the numbers. There was more recent data in London that showed how many Black people had been stopped, which is higher than when we wrote that article a little way back, which means you're giving power to, or more authority to, people who are already quite powerful. And because of that historical kind of institutional racism that exists within the police, they're doing more harm. So the biometric that you just mentioned, obviously that access to the Home Office, which has been a campaign that we're working on Stop the Scan, means they have even more access. They can pick somebody up in the street and send them off to lock them up. But what we've seen, for example, we're based in Leeds, or in West Yorkshire, should I say, but the communities who've been targeted, for example, the Roma community, are people, I don't even know whether the data is not come out yet, I don't think, but they're the people who haven't got jobs, to kind of be furloughed. They do on a kind of day-to-day basis, which means they have to continuously go out. The people who are on lowest, as we've seen with all these campaigns that have been going on about, for example, the key workers, the people who are likely to be key workers are people on a lower socioeconomic conditions or backgrounds, which has meant these powers are likely to affect those communities most. People who are working in the grey economy, not just, for example, not just car washes, but anything that means they have to go out. The numbers you've spoken about, 1.4 million not able to access benefits, not able to be supported by the government as it has done other people in the community, means somebody has to provide for that family. Somebody has to pay rent. Somebody has, because nobody else will. Somebody has to provide uniform. Somebody has to do all of these things, and when they don't have any other alternative in terms of a buffer, then they'll go out to work. And here we are finding them. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the numbers are saying who's out there, but also the situations that these communities live in. We were giving examples to the police just the other week that most people are perhaps overpopulated in terms of the housing that they have. They probably have more, in the number of people living in one household. They probably don't have back gardens. They probably don't have even television. And again, this is another story when you talk about people who are seeking asylum, people who are destitute. They don't have anything to stay in and A, do the telecommunications, B, to even entertain them or keep them busy. So when they come out in the streets and a neighbor rings up the police and then the police come and give them fines that cannot afford to pay, it becomes that kind of whole cycle. So the question on whether the police are the right people to do this, the answer is no. There could have been other ways. I know we've spoken about defunding the police in different measures, and it's not saying we want, it's saying that they should, that money, that power, that whatever else that they're being given to, could be given to somebody else in the community, to other people in the community who are likely to engage with them on a one-to-one basis without necessarily the consequences of which could lead to, the consequences could be quite dire.
Well, I mean, and that's astonishing. But one of the things that was astonishing to me, to come back to that 1.4 million number, is how can that number be so large? Is that all due to immigration status? Because I'm aware that there's a large amount of people in the grey economy, but is that all due to immigration status? And if so, how is this number so large and so unreported? you know, in some circles, they're going to be asking how on earth are people living in the country without you know, being able to access the benefits of the state. Could you explain a bit of what the background is for this large population?
Sure. The people who have no I think the partly why it's not so documented could be to do with the fact that right-wing press and media and politicians continue to kind of take advantage of saying people are coming here to take from them. So there's the assumption that people who come here get access to everything else that the rest of the citizens get, which is not true. So, for example, students on visas, people who've come here on marriage visas as well, people who are going through the asylum process, people who haven't got indefinite stay to stay in this country, all fall under that bag. We know there's actually worse situations, for example, and again, this is a bill that's been going through more recently around domestic abuse. So people who haven't got legal status to stay in the country, if you're experiencing domestic abuse, you cannot access the refugees or domestic violence places that people go for safety, and that's a rule. So and that's just one of them. There's many more in terms of whether you have access to secondary mental health. But when we come back to, so the numbers are large and probably even larger because there is also undocumented migrants who perhaps not even known of their existence in this country. So when you're not legally, or not even legally, because you are legally here even when you're on a visa, but because you haven't got the citizenship or status regularized in a way where you're able to access, it means you have got no protections. So for those people who are perhaps here for 1 year and then they've been furloughed or they've been made redundant, the jobs have ended, it means they have nothing else, and that's why the numbers are so large. And I think there is a call for people to know more about these communities. Some of the campaigns that we started just this year around COVID was to ask that question about who is aware of these communities who not only have difficulty, haven't got the digital devices to access and go online and keep updated with the messy messages we've been getting on what we should and should not do around COVID. Some of them haven't got the devices, but there's also things like language barriers. There's also things like computer literacy barriers. So, and when everybody was told ring up your council and ask for food and we'll drop food parcels, where is the social aspect of people who, for example, have migrated? And we work with people who have migrated, who are going through the asylum process as a single woman or a single man, hasn't got family. And the only place that they had or access to was a center that they drop off like once a month or once a week, should I say. And then suddenly all these places were shut. Where is that social support? And then on the back of that, we have the hostile environment, which means a lot of those communities, Black and brown communities, migrant communities, and also poor communities are quite fearful of authority, whether it's the police because of this data sharing stuff that they do with the Home Office, whether it's the local councils, whether it's the social services. So nobody's coming forward. So when we were asking, how are we catering for these communities who are continue to be invisible, even though they're quite large in our numbers around where we are? Who's asking this question? So yeah, so it is quite large and it's concerning. And I think for me, the call is for people to know more about this and also continuously think about how do we change, because we still have what I call apartheid in terms of laws and rules, where we have one rule for everybody else in terms of people who are here, who are citizens, and then another rule for everybody else. And why do we have that, especially when we're going through a crisis that we have right now in this world, the pandemic?
Yeah, with the backdrop of the pandemic, it's particularly damning. But as you say, and as the term you've used, this is an historical reality. And I want to come on to talk about Stop the Scan and what institutional racism is, you know, in this historical context and stuff, you know, because these are all kind of big words that sometimes don't really mean very much to people, or sometimes get their backs up because, you know, it feels like a pointed dig. But before we do that, the comment that was made by Chiwe that was shown on the screen, I'd like to bring Adam in as well, that you talked about the Roma, and I think they've been particularly invisibilized. And I know Adam's done some research on this, and I'd love to hear, Adam, some of the things that you've been covering, track and trace with Open Democracy, and maybe you could tell us some of the stories you've heard about what's going on with the Roma community. And again, then I'll come to you, Penny, to dig a little deeper on that as well.
Sure. I mean, the first thing to say is this is a phenomenon right across Europe. The UK is just as guilty, but I spent February just before the pandemic traveling around Central European countries like Hungary and Slovakia and Ukraine, and the treatment of Roma communities in those countries is about 10% of the population of Hungary and Slovakia. Is always horrific, and that's particularly been the case during the pandemic. So in the first months of the pandemic, for example, there were Roma villages which were essentially kind of forcibly shut with barricades, but where there weren't sufficient shops for food and medicine. So people were kind of stranded in these villages, unable to leave them without access to the food they need. In the UK, partly because of racism, the Gypsy Roma traveller community is very, very heavily self-employed. And so you might remember that at the start of the lockdown, there was this period where the government had a furlough scheme for people who were employed, but not people who were self-employed. And so that caused massive problems, and I spoke to activists from the community who were talking about how, they had no idea how they were going to feed their families next month. And that's before you get to the questions which, Penny's absolutely right to highlight and write about, of police discrimination and police racism, and absolutely that, affects lots of different racialized communities, Black people, particularly at the moment talked about, but they equally affect our Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, who are treated appallingly by a lot of police forces right across the country. And I said before, I'm here in Scotland, and I just want to touch on the fact that we've heard a lot about Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Tories, recently, but Douglas Ross sort of first became prominent in Scottish politics because of a story that I broke along with others, where he'd said in an interview that if he was Prime Minister for a day, then his number one priority would be tougher enforcement against Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. And I just think that, imagine if a politician had said that about any other ethnic minority in the country. Would they go on to be elected leader of their party? Would they go on to be treated in the press as anything other than the bigot they are? And, I think that as journalists, we have to think very hard about the fact that we've allowed someone who said that about one of our ethnic minority communities to continue to be treated as a serious politician rather than continually denounced as the racist he is.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Penny, talking about racism, what your article to me shows is the nature of institutional racism. What it is that we're talking about here is large institutions that disproportionately negatively affect different ethnic minority communities, Black, Asian, Roma, and so on. And often this discussion gets dragged into discussions about culture and individual actions and so forth, which are also incredibly important. But this report to me talks about like the practical and material harms. Do you see that that this kind of work should be more widely discussed and more prominently discussed when we're talking about institutional racism and brought to the fore when we talk about these things? Or are there actually, in fact, even other important areas that we should be talking about instead?
Yeah, I think there's still this whole confusion between racism and racialization, and I think the problem we have or find is we focus on racialization, which is about personal power or personal treating somebody differently on a personal level, as opposed to the institutions, which racism is institutions, and being able to see and because majority of times, even time and time again, police going through unconscious bias training and God knows what else, means we assume it's just the person who can be racist as opposed to institutions and systems, which is what we're dealing with and have been dealing with for millennia. Because when we kind of go back to the reason why we see and continue to see some of these practices goes back to the enslavement, when we were dehumanizing people, and then all the way to colonialism as well. So until we acknowledge that history, until we really see and unpack that, why is it that we fear? Why is it that we don't want certain people coming into the country or staying in the country and taking, I think I was seeing an article last night on how many deportations have happened during lockdown. And sometimes actually they're flying one person back to some country in Europe, just one person. Why is it that we're willing to spend that much to avoid having people here? Until we acknowledge that history and how everything is connected, then people will continue to have their backs up and also think all we need to do is provide you with one police officer who did such and such a thing, and racism is sorted. Because up until now, despite all the reports that we've had, the police still continue to deny racism, or there is racism going on there. And it's not just with individuals, it's kind of individual, then institution, and reinforcing each other. So to get rid of it is really difficult. So to bring to light this just one specific thing where it seems like, yeah, police, who are the police? Let's understand where did the police come from? What are the origins of police force as it exists right now? Because if we understand that, we understand why they're there to protect the interests of a few and to guard the interests of those few people, not necessarily for everybody. And I think particularly now when we talk about the access to data, the power that they have already in terms of they could send you back to your country on the back of just an interaction. So just earlier today, we were talking about how they've participated when people have migrated. They've participated in court cases when people are going for their citizenship. That stop and search it might not be, for somebody else to be like slap on the wrist. For somebody who's migrated, it's actually quite detrimental because of the consequences and these are children who are being stopped in the street, but actually having an impact on their parents' application to citizenship. And this is Operation Nexus. There's many more examples of how that means. So for people to begin to unpack and see how something that can just be drawn out quite like a blanket, like, yeah, this is for everybody. Actually, let's understand the components. Let's understand multiple oppressions. Let's understand the intersections within this. Because similarly to, again, what has just been said now, Adam, around the Gypsy and the Traveller community, this Pronto, this biometrics fingerprint thing was trialed at I found out quite recently one of the annual things that they do. I can't remember what it's called, Ascot, where the Gypsy community travel to go do an annual celebration. They were using those machines there. Why are we going to those communities? Because up until now, we're asking who's been stopped and searched, and we're still struggling to find out why would they take these machines there? Because the way they snack up, I don't know whether we're still going to get some time to talk about the stop and scan and what and how it emerged from going.
I mean, it's absolutely horrifying. And yeah, I have to at some point move us on. So I'm going to give you a minute, if you can, about stop the scan, the campaign. The link is going to be in the description. What I'm going to promise the viewers is, Penny, you and I, we're going to do an in-depth interview separate to this at some other point and put it up on the channel some point soon, because I feel like there's so much information we need to let people know about, and we just don't have the time here today. But it's blowing my mind. So tell people about Stop and Scan. Tell them to get involved with the Racial Justice Network, and then we'll crack on.
Okay, yeah, I'll do it in a minute. So yeah, to go look on the website, stopthescan.co.uk. And it is really like, again, this item or this technology was launched or piloted in West Yorkshire in 2018. It's been rolled out around the country right now, and 23 forces are using it. And it just it's the police having access. That little machine, when they stop you in the street and they fingerprint you, they have access to not just criminal record, but if you've got any migration history. So again, we know what the Home Office is like and how they mess up in terms of how they enter things, the consequences of you having wrong data or having wrong data on you, and the fact that the police can then ring the Home Office and come and pick you up, and they're out and about in the streets is quite dire. So yeah, for anybody who wants to get involved, I'd suggest to look on there. But it's when they doubt your identity, and I think this is where we were saying this is racial, this is judging you, but also stereotyping, because who are the people who are most likely to be stopped and searched, stopped and scanned? And this is where we're extending it. It is definitely to do Black, brown, migrant communities, but also poor communities. So the Roma, the Gypsy traveler communities are the ones who've been targeted with this.
Excellent. That was beautifully on time, and it's so important. I do recommend people check it out. Check out the links in the description. And before we move on to the next topic, I just want to shout out a couple of things, which is, first off, we have a Telegram channel. You'll be aware that social media is rubbish, right? It's destroying our lives in so many different ways, but it's particularly bad for independent media who have to spend money to reach their audience. We're paying Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to get people who already like and follow us to see the stories from the publications that they already like and follow. So we're encouraging people to move on to Telegram. It's an open channel. You don't have to give anyone your number. You just click on the link and you'll get updates from us 3 times a week. Little collection of 2, 3, 4, 5 articles tops, 5 articles tops of the best independent media. That's 3 times a week, 5 articles, the best independent media into your inbox and Telegram. So check out that link. Also check out the 2 organizations who come together to put this on, the Media Fund and Now Then, and we'll talk about a bit more about them at the end of the show. But do get on that Telegram channel. Let us be able to communicate with you so you can hear the best stuff unfiltered by big tech and these corporate giants that are ruining our minds. Right. Now we're moving on to how food banks went global with Hazel Healy from the New Internationalist. This is another fantastic piece. Honestly, this is why we need independent media. The stuff that we're talking about today is incredible. So how food banks went global. Let me read from the article. The rise of food charity in some of the most affluent countries is surely a sign that something has gone badly wrong. So why is this broken model being exported to the rest of the world? Across the UK, emergency relief has become a lifeline to an ever-widening subset of society. Users range from people forced into destitution by immigration rules, as we've discussed a bit, to working families on low or insecure incomes, and those on benefits, including people with disabilities that won't stretch. Although classified as a nation with a stable food supply, a 2018 report on the UK's progress against Sustainable Development Goal 2, i.e. zero hunger, warned that deep inequalities within the country mean that it is struggling to address malnutrition. At first glance, food banks dishing out unsold food can look like a pragmatic win-win. But what began as emergency stopgaps have become a permanent fixture for millions across the rich world, begging urgent questions. How did so many people come to rely on food parcels? When did access to food become a matter for charity rather than rights? And as food banks start to crop up from Jordan to Guatemala, why are they being promoted as a solution to hunger across the world? Hazel, fantastic piece, and this is something you're going to be working on all year round, I believe. Again, in the links we've included a couple of extra things from the food justice files. What is it called? Sorry, is it the food files? Food justice files? So please check them out. These are really great investigations. I've got to again ask some sort of basic questions for the audience. First off, what is a food bank and a food charity? What's the difference here? And how many food banks are there really in the UK?
Well, the numbers are quite shocking. So just to go back to the definition, a food bank is really a place where someone can access free food. So that might be a church hall or a community centre or drop-in. And it usually comes in the form of food parcels. And in terms of the scale, Trussell Trust, which is the biggest provider, has got 400 food banks, which I think distribute to 1,200 different places. And then there's a network of 900 independent food banks. So this is happening on a massive scale. And I think another interesting point, and what we were trying to do with this piece to give some context, was to think back to when this really all began, because food banks, there's always been patchwork support, mostly through faith communities and support support for the homeless and for certain vulnerable communities. But it's not happened on this scale before. So in 2011, the Trussell Trust was giving out 130,000 food parcels, and in March, in less than 10 years, that reached 1.9 million. So really, we're trying to stop at this point and give some background and say, how did we get here, and really, what's the exit strategy?
Yeah, those again incredible numbers, and it surprises me all the time when we talk about these things, and when I'm doing the research for the show, that I'm like, I can't, that we hear about these things, but sometimes it's never hammered home in the way that the investigations that you guys are doing have proven. One of the things that astounded me was the idea that these are being exported over the world. So are they really occurring all over the world, and where are they going, and how are they getting there? What's occurring here?
So there's something called the Global Food Banking Network, and it's based in Chicago. And this is one of the bodies that is promoting food banks as a solution to hunger. And it may not surprise you that it's also, it's got some very big corporate partners. So people like the agribusiness firm Cargill, the BlackRock investment firm, PepsiCo, Caterpillar, people like that. And the reason that these big food corporations or people involved in food, perhaps not in the case of Caterpillar, though perhaps it makes tractors, I'm not sure what its connection is, but these big, extremely rich corporations have an interest in obviously making themselves look good. But in the case of food companies in particular, food banks are a way for charities to actually deal with their waste problem. So we'll come back to that point in a little bit. But in terms of how it's spreading, this global food banking network has over 900 members. There are now food banks in 80 countries, and there's been a 23% increase just in the last year. There's someone who's tracking this. He's about to bring out a book, and his name is Dan Warshawski. And he's been kind of tracking this over time and thinking about the reasons behind it. The Americans are particularly good on this because they really invented food banks and have a whole sort of shadow system running alongside the kind of corporate retail industrialized food chain. So they're really the people who started it all, and they're also the ones who are exporting it now. Well,
when we talk about this, and you say, oh, it's a solution to food waste. Is that a bad thing? I mean, should the food just go in the bin? Isn't it good that it's getting used?
So that's I think that's a really seductive idea, that no one wants good food to go to waste. And having produced the waste, is it better that it gets eaten by somebody? Yes. Can that be channeled to like quite innovative, dynamic projects that cook up meals for people and use food in really interesting ways? And like environmentally, of course, there needs to be a solution to food waste. But I think the problem is that you're dealing with the waste situation really downstream. So you're not questioning why supermarkets have 50 to 100% more on their shelves that they could feasibly sell at any time. You're not questioning why it is that there's massive overproduction in the first place. And we know that that's about efficiency, it's about speed, and ultimately it's about profits. But there are all sorts of what's known as externalities, costs. The food may be cheap at the end of it, or it may be making big profits, but it's not cheap for the environment. And ultimately it's not necessarily providing the nutrition that people need. So this relationship between food banks, waste, and corporations has led Dan, I can't look at his name each time or I'll say it wrong, Dan Warshawski has called food banks a corporate market correction mechanism for the food retail sector, which I think is really interesting because it's not the way you usually think about it. And so I think the problem with this is that, yes, the food might as well be eaten now it's been produced and it's about to go in the bin, but it's really a distraction from the structural reasons that people go hungry. So you will have a company like Asda, which gave 25 million to FareShare, which is intermediary that dishes out food to charities, and the Trussell Trust, 25 million, but it fails to pay many of its own workers a minimum wage. So the food banks allows the certain things to go unquestioned, structural reasons for food poverty, whilst allowing some of the people who are behind that to come out looking like saviors. But I think, also the thing that's really interesting, we spoke to African aid workers about food banks opening up in the Congo, and Salome Ntuba was really surprised at this and was like, but we don't give out food, we give out cash. Like the question about, if people can, it's not about actually being able to access food, it's about it's not about the availability of food, it's about your capacity to access it. And so she was talking about how cash is way more dignified, that humanitarians arrive in Haiti after an earthquake. They don't dish out food, they give money to market traders so women can start cooking again and selling and get things moving in the local economy. Like, it's totally retrograde to be giving out this really humiliating, despite volunteers' best efforts, humiliating way of receiving aid. When there are so many other ways to do it. And we talk about lots of other ways to do it that are more positive, and also lots of the people who are involved in giving out food are also campaigning against low benefits, long waits for benefits, about the structural reasons for poverty in the first place. And I think that's happening more and more. And there are also various food projects which I could mention after, where people are finding ways to really challenge the structural causes at the same time as feeding people, because feeding people is an important thing to do, and there's great value in looking after each other. So it's not to say we have to stop doing that, but we have to do it in ways that challenge the reason we're doing it in the first place.
Yeah, and so what you're saying here is there's an interconnected problem, there's a structural problem. This is a bigger picture. So when we talk about food banks, we're talking about the failings on many levels of society, on the one hand, but on the other hand, many people would paint it as a set of personal failings. And here's where I'd like to bring in KerryAnn Mendoza, because I know that you fight with the right-wing press on the regular. There's people out there, and they get on the BBC, who will say, in a country as rich as ours, the fact that food banks are being used is a sign of people's personal failings. It's not something that the government should be held responsible for. It should be people learning how to manage their budgets. So, I mean, what would you say to that kind of argument? Oh, have we lost KerryAnn? Oh, in which case,
here I am.
Bring in you, Adam. Oh, you're
Hello?
here. Okay, yeah, lovely.
She's in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. What would you say?
I think, to be honest, I begin with some expletives in response to someone making a comment as ridiculous as that, but I'm conscious we need to keep it civil. It's just the usual nonsense, essentially, from neoliberals, which is they never, ever attribute any negative aspects of living in a neoliberal society to neoliberalism. So all of those ill effects have to be reduced to essentially character flaws. You didn't try hard enough, you're lazy, you're a shirker, those kinds of things. When obviously it's completely ridiculous, because we've seen any country that implements a sustainable welfare state, that has decent workers' rights, where people get decent pay for their work and their labour, they're not starving. It's not because those people have better character, it's because their economic system is more efficient at moving resources around. It's as simple as that. And neoliberalism, sort of disaster capitalism, is about hoarding resources and all of us fighting over those resources, rather than actually making sure that they're going to the right places at the right times, in the right amounts. We've really got a kind of, I want to say a double crisis, but it's far more extensive than that at the moment, where we've had simultaneously an ideological austerity agenda, which has just absolutely gutted the welfare state, while simultaneously gutting workers' rights, pay, terms and conditions, and all of these things. So actually both places that a working class person would look to gain enough tokens, in cash, to be able to buy the things that they need, pay their rent, eat. Both of those have just sort of vanished in front of them, and we're now kind of really going back to sort of 1920s, 30s stuff at the moment, a sort of digitalized version of the sort of the queue of labourers arriving at the docks on a Monday morning, you know, being picked out for work. You know, that's essentially 0 hours contracts or that, you know, and it's just a sort of technological version of that style of complete lack of genuine employment. It's simply accessing people to perform labour and paying them the lowest possible amount of money to do that, while also diverting the welfare state that should be working on the public to a corporate welfare state, which is also channeling cash towards those corporations. It's just breathtaking.
It's what would you add to that, Adam? Does that seem to you a fair assessment?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's fascinating, as you say, is so often we're presented with this idea that it's kind of individuals who are responsible for this. And as you say, sometimes, Tom, that's in a very kind of explicit blamey way, you know, this sort of shirkers and so on narrative. But also quite often it's done in what I think is a more insidious way, which is the kind of self-help. You know, the solution to this is you just need to, you know, do this thing. You need to get better at these recipes, or, you know, cook in this way, or you need to get more education and so on. Or you need to work harder. And I think you see a lot of this in kind of, you know, Facebook memes about like ways you can change your life and all this stuff. And I think that, you know, the question you have to ask yourself is, what happened in 2011? You know, Hazel gave some very stark stats about the increase in hunger in 2011. Is it that we all suddenly got lazier? Is it that, you know, hundreds of thousands of people suddenly decided they couldn't be bothered working anymore? Or is it that the Conservative government rolled out an austerity program and cut public services and wages were slashed significantly on the back of that? And you know, I think it's quite obviously the latter. It's not that there was suddenly a breakout, a kind of epidemic of laziness in the UK. It's that there was a Tory government.
Yes, and if we bring in Hazel here, I think you know, how do you find this argument that really it's about personal failings rather than, you know, systemic or structural ones?
Yeah, I'd just say it's just not borne out by the evidence. So when the research that looks at when and how people access food banks, just to like add to what Adam said, is, you know, people will pawn their possessions, risk losing their housing before they go to food banks. So the idea that this is just like an easy option or something that isn't a last resort for people is really an insult and doesn't reflect, you know, the realities that people are living. You speak to anyone who's living in food poverty, they'll be the first to tell you that.
Yeah. And Penny, we had a comment here from the audience about UBI. Do you think UBI is a potential solution for this huge problem that we face around food banks, and a way of shifting the way that we do things?
Yeah, I think it might be, as long as we kind of stay cautious to how, not just, the capitalizing of things or kind of commercializing of things, but if we did have universal base income and able to cater for everybody, regardless of, not just status, but or where you were born or whatever, I think it'd be a really unique way of holding and carrying everybody and kind of having a safety net for people who haven't got some of the previous conversations we were having about people who have nothing else left, not savings, no nothing. I think it would be a good way of balancing things out. But the caution obviously is it always goes back to even what we saw with mutual aid, where the origins of came from a really good place, same as the food banks came from a really good place, and then being co-opted. But I think having gone through what we are going through right now, and the fact that I think definitely believe the world is in a crisis, it means another way is needed and another way is forward, and maybe we've learned some of those lessons. So yeah.
Well, that's a really good way to end this brilliant discussion. And as I say, definitely check out the links in the description. I'm going to keep pushing them because it's worth going away, supporting these independent media, reading the stuff firsthand, but also, like I say, you know, link up, subscribe, become on their email list and so forth. I'm going to push the Telegram channel again. click on that link in the description. And we're having to say goodbye to KerryAnn Mendoza and Penny right now. We're going to finish on one last piece from Adam Ramsay in Open Democracy. It's a huge one. You've got to stick around for it. But I just want to say thanks so much to Penny and KerryAnn Mendoza. They're fantastic. The work they're doing is invaluable. And I really want you to support the Canary and the Racial Justice Network. Really do check them out. Links in the description. Right. Let's introduce this piece from Open Democracy, and it's bloody fantastic. So, politically connected firms were given high priority for government COVID contracts, official report finds. And again, this is indicative of what Open Democracy are doing. They're talking about this, but they were talking about it when people weren't, and we'll get into that. Anyways, companies with political connections were directed to a high priority channel for UK government contracts, where bids were 10 times more likely to be successful, according to a damning report by the National Audit Office, right? So 10 times more likely down this high priority channel. Around 10% of the suppliers referred to the channel by a political contact were awarded a PPE contract, the NAO reported. Suppliers without such links, by contrast, only had a 1% chance of winning a contract. More than £10 billion worth of contracts were awarded without competition during this period, the spending watchdog found, with a special channel set up that allowed almost 500 suppliers with links to politicians or senior officials to pitch directly for work. Since the pandemic began, Open Democracy has reported on numerous COVID contracts being awarded without competition, or with terms being kept secret, or other measures which bypass normal transparency requirements. Labour MP Dawn Butler, a member of the House of Commons Science and Technology Select Committee, labelled the absence of oversight in the procurement process a national scandal. Before we move on to Dawn Butler's comments, I just want to bring up this one graphic as well that George Mumbia put up today. It's a little tweet where he mentions that the BBC is now saying that they broke this story and taking credit for the fantastic hard work done by Byline Times, Open Democracy, reported on by the Canary, by the way, and some journalists at The Guardian, and other outlets as well, a couple of other independent outlets. But really, I think the key drivers on this have been Open Democracy and Byline Times that we had last week. So I want to bring in Adam here and ask him a few questions about this, seeing as he's Open Democracy and himself have been following this from the beginning. Now, first off, I'm just going to get a dig in at Labour, because this is what Andrew Neil or someone like that would do, and I'm going to channel him for a moment. Dawn Butler called it a national disgrace, a national scandal, that there's no oversight, or the absence of oversight in the procurement process, which is the way that we get stuff. The way that government gets stuff, there was no one overlooking that. That's what it is in plain English. But Labour have been equally bad on privatisation and procurement, haven't they? In their history, when they were in government, they were pretty bad. It's just opportunism.
Well, look, we need to understand that this is kind of, the current playing out of a process that, absolutely began when Labour started privatising the NHS, and they introduced internal markets, and there were a whole series of scandals back then, and that's got, as people predicted it would at the time, bigger and bigger and bigger. But it is a new scale. It is bigger again, because services which, in many cases, I think shouldn't be privatised in the first place, by the way, are given not just to private companies, but to basically the mates of people in power, which is what this report is ultimately saying, is a whole new level of sort of what we can only call cronyism at the heart of our response to this pandemic. And I think the thing that is really important to understand is that the UK is going into a second lockdown because of the failure of the test and trace system. So when the test and trace system, which was privatized to these companies, which turn out to basically be the mates of people in power, and those companies failed to deliver it sufficiently to stop us from going to a second lockdown, that corruption, that cronyism, is the reason that more people are dying from COVID, and also is the reason that we're going into a second lockdown.
Yeah, but isn't that just the government relying on people that they could trust in a health emergency? I mean, Isn't that an understandable and acceptable course of action? This is what people do. They reach out to people that they know and say, "Hey, can you help us out here? We're in a crisis."
Well, I think firstly, the pretty good evidence, given how badly Britain has done compared to other countries in this pandemic, is that they couldn't trust them. Why should we be trusting major global corporations whose only duty is to profit for their shareholders? Why aren't they, for example, investing all this extra money into the NHS, into local government, into public services that do exist and are accountable to the people, do exist in order to make our lives better? Why are they chucking all this cash at essentially their rich mates?
Well, as I mentioned before, now this story is pretty common knowledge. It's on WhatsApp. People mention it in WhatsApp groups across the country, and it gets used on Gogglebox, and people will refer to it as common parlance. Oh yeah, we just know that the Conservatives dole out cash to their mates on failed cock-ups, basically. But it wasn't to begin with, was it? How did open democracy get into this, and how hard was it to get the establishment media to take this story and run with it?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that massive credit goes to a couple of my colleagues. My colleague Kerry-Ann Mendoza has been investigating privatisation of the NHS since about 2012 and breaking lots of extraordinary stories in that space. So this is, in journalism terms, this is about long-term development of the beat. My colleague Peter Gagan, who's our investigations editor, has also been churning out lots of great stories about this. And so, so part of it's that. Part of it is, we've talked in the pandemic as it started about, what is it that we should be investigating? And if you're in journalism, you should be asking yourself the question, what's the power that we're seeking to interrogate? And one of the questions we asked ourselves is, well, who's going to profiteer from the back of this crisis? Because there's always someone in any given crisis, sat there looking at the disaster and rubbing their hands together thinking, well, this is going to make me some money. And so, we saw it as our job to ask ourselves that question and look into it. And it turned out not to be hard. It turned out that the UK government, perhaps to no one's surprise, really was behaving quite badly and is doling out contracts to friendly companies, to people they know. And so I suppose for me, it starts off with Caroline's long-term work, but B, also asking that question, which you should always ask as a journalist, which is, what is the power that we're going to hold to account in this situation?
And did this take a while before the establishment media?
Yeah. So I think the thing that's fascinating, in a sense, the reason I chose this story, which is much more recent than a lot of this work we've been doing, is that this was the point that a lot of the kind of traditional media picked up on it. And I find that fascinating because what that means is, the National Audit Office is a kind of institution of government. And people whose job it is meant to be to hold power to account were only willing to really do that job in many cases once a powerful body told them it was okay. So once they got permission from the National Audit Office to say, oh yeah, this is a bad thing, then they're able to report on the fact that it's a bad thing. But the fact that the thing had happened, we had all the documents. It's not like anyone contested that this was going on. The fact that it happened wasn't sufficient. They had to wait until those in power, a group of them, the National Audit Office, said, oh yeah, no, it is okay for you to kick those other people in power. But they weren't going to, just go and do the jobs themselves too often.
Yeah, that's a pretty damning indictment of the media, isn't it? And it's what we often talk about in our circles about the over-reliance on official sources, and have inherent self-interest often in maintaining those in power and keeping them in power. So they're not always the best sources, and also it means you're not doing journalism. Now, partially that might be due to budgetary constraints, but Hazel, I want to bring this to another question, which is, what do you think this story tells us about the state of British politics, particularly how the government and the state deals with crises and providing for its citizens? Is this something unique, or as Adam says, this is the question you should always ask yourself, there's always going to be someone profiting from a crisis? I mean, isn't that a sad state of affairs?
Yes, but it wouldn't be the first time we'd seen it. I mean, I think the point with a crisis is it allows you to take shortcuts and to do things without people really noticing, and to do things quickly, except luckily for us, open democracy has been, had its eye on dark money and before this and following the money now, and is able to pull them up. But I think some of the things I've found so shocking is how ill prepared some of these companies were, that they've dished out large amounts of money to do things that they'd never done before. I don't know if that's something you'd like to elaborate on, Adam, but I found that, it's almost comical. I mean, I find it, like you talk about cronyism, it sort of defies belief that a company that had never ever done the thing that they're asking them to do before would be awarded contracts on these terms. So I think it's completely shocking and not the least bit surprising, and it's the sort of thing people try and get away with in situations like these. So, hats off to open democracy really for getting it out there.
Yeah, did that surprise you though, actually, Adam, that I mean, we see cronyism, we maybe even expect it now in a crisis. Did you expect the cronyism to be this flawed, this, fallible? Like, I mean, they just didn't come close to being able to do anything right as far as any, as I say, to the point often this kind of corruption, which is often a feature of the system rather than something different, can go unnoticed because usually a good deal of the services and so forth that we need are still being provided, sort of. Enough people are okay, but this seems to be widely just a massive fail.
I think that, one of the ways to understand the sort of developing political situation over the last generation or so in the UK is not that the corruption is increased. It's not that the sort of extent to which the ruling class looks after the rest of the ruling class has grown. It's that they've got worse and worse at it. And so it's become more and more visible. So, we see this with the, up until 2008, it's true that the very rich are enriching themselves, but they're clever enough at least to, lend everyone money so that we keep buying stuff from them so that they can make more money back. And then the financial crisis happens because they hadn't really understood that they were doing that. They hadn't understood that, that was the way the economy was working. And they've tried to reinflate that level since, but people have kind of seen through that. We see that similarly with, whether you go back to the phone hacking scandal. It's not like that stuff wasn't happening before. It's just that, they were incompetent enough to get caught. And I think the way I see this is, in a sense, part of a long history which goes all the way back to empire, where, the British ruling class, they went around conquering the world and killing people in order to steal their stuff. But that at least gave them enough resource to be kind of good at being evil rulers. They were kind of successful in that task. Whereas what's happened since is they've kind of decayed quite a lot to the point that they're also quite incompetent.
Yeah, that's an incredible, insightful point, and one that I will ponder as we draw towards the end of our show this week. We try and give 20 minutes for every section. So, but I think, you've absolutely nailed it in a very concise way, and I've really enjoyed that. And I'm going to be going away thinking about some of those thoughts, the decay even of our ruling class. But before we move on and I say congratulations and plug some more bits and bobs, I just wanted to ask you what you think people could do about this, because I know one organisation that sort of utilised open democracy's work quite a lot is We Own It, and they very much campaign for public ownership. And I thought that was a good organisation to shout out and ask people to get involved in. But are there any organisations that you guys think people should get involved in? And do you have any final comments or thoughts on this story in particular?
Well, I mean, of course, I would suggest that you, if you like our journalism, then you can always give us money. We do, we rely on donations from readers more and more, and that's what allows us to, have those kind of open conversations about what to do next. And so in a sense, without people donating to us, we wouldn't have been able to do this work. We Own It are great, a big fan, absolutely. Do sign up to them. But I think that, I'm not going to recommend individual organizations. What I will say is it's very important to ask the big systemic questions when you see this kind of crisis. That one of the things that, Naomi Klein very, accurately described how the super rich behave in a crisis, which is they see it as an opportunity to change the whole system. And so we shouldn't think of this as a kind of aberration. We should think of this as potentially the new normal. I think it's our job to equally imagine what new normal could look like and what we want it to look like, and to demand that. And so, It's not just about individual organizations, although there are many out there and you should go and find them. It's about using the crisis to think about how you think the world should be and then working together with others in order to make it like that.
Amazing. Hazel, do you have any final thoughts on the story or what people should do?
No, we've commissioned Peter from Open Democracy to write a piece in our upcoming Democracy edition, which is looking at all these similar themes and whether you can trust people anymore in the age of extreme digital marketing, whether we can even trust ourselves. Interesting.
Oh, Christ. Well, let's end on the next crisis.
March edition, New Internationalist. That's how far ahead we work in the print media.
Well, that's actually really both those answers actually bring up a great way to end the show. First off, I just want to bring up a comment that someone left us, and I really appreciate these. So thanks for all the comments, but we're going to end on one that pats ourselves on the back, which says from Rafe Khan, articulate guests speaking knowledgeably about important underreported current affairs. Nice one. Cheers, Rafe. Really appreciated, and really appreciated any feedback. We will put up clips of each speaker standalone as the full sort of 20-minute segment on YouTube, but also there'll be 1-minute clips, and they'll be coming out all the way through next week. So subscribe to News Club or wherever you're watching this. We're on a lot of different channels, the Media Fund, Now Then, Bywire. We're all over the place, Festival of Debate. Do follow those and look out for those videos, and do share them. Encourage people to share these as well, because again, this is how we break through some of the algorithmic puzzles. It's a difficult thing, but it's also at the same time a simple thing. It's a couple of clicks of a mouse, and sometimes you feel a bit odd sticking information out there into the world instead of posting pictures of puppies, which I personally love. But share this if you can. If we can give you something shareable, please do help us reach some more people. We want to get independent media to new people, and specifically what Hazel and Adam were finishing on there, we're talking about how far ahead they plan in print, how much they need the freedom to think and question power, and that comes from donations and from support from a community, because this is independent media. It does not rely on corporations or the government or billionaires who are not paying their tax to fund them. So they have the freedom to question power and to do interesting, important journalism, but it's our responsibility to ensure that they can do that, that we are all part of that process of giving ourselves the information we need about the world to make the decisions and make the changes we need to see, and we need to see them rapidly. So please support these organizations. Please do follow us. You can find a list of all of our independent media partners at the Media Fund. It's about 40 independent media organizations that we say are not only independent in terms of funding and editorial direction, but also abide by the NUJ Code of Conduct, therefore trustworthy news sources. Please check them out. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe to us and hit that bell button, because then you get told when we're coming up. We're here every Thursday, 5 p.m. I know that was a big, long plug. I know that was a lot of stuff, but we really appreciate you being around. We really appreciate you sharing it. And we really need your support to help change society. This is going to be one of the ways that we do it. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one. Check out the stuff in the description. See you.